I had 60 seconds before the champagne toast turned into a bloodbath. My fingers felt too small, too clumsy, as I creased the napkin until the edges were sharp enough to cut. The ink on the scrap of paper was still tacky, a dark stain of truth hidden in the palm of my hand. Around us, the gala breathed with a heavy, artificial grace. The rhythmic clink of silver against bone china, the suffocating scent of expensive lilies, and the rhythmic tap of Sumin's heels as she signaled the end from her phone. Beyond the heavy oak doors, the elevators were already climbing, carrying the men who were coming to turn this gold room red. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the smell of wood smoke and betrayal. I stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains, moving through the forest of tailored suits like a ghost. I walked toward the head table as if I were stepping off a ledge. Baek Sung-il sat at the center of it all, his silhouette carved against the city lights. A king who didn't yet know his crown was made of glass. Welcome back to Stories with Ross, besties. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The ink was still wet on the scrap of paper, but the blood on the floor was already cooling in my mind. I had 10 seconds to save a king, or one lifetime to regret being a witness. To the men in this room, I was nothing more than a flicker in the periphery. A child in a blue dress who belonged to the scenery, as silent as the marble pillars. They didn't see me, but I saw everything. I saw the way Park Sumin's thumb hovered over her screen, her face illuminated by the cold, blue light of a final command. I saw the shadow of the server's hand trembling as he adjusted a tray of crystal flutes. Most of all, I saw the man who had once knelt in the dirt to tie my shoelace when the world was too busy to look down. I moved. My shoes made no sound on the plush carpet, a ghost navigating a graveyard of living men. The distance to the head table felt like a mile of open water. As I approached, the air grew colder, thick with the scent of Sung-il's expensive cologne and the metallic tang of the storm brewing outside. I didn't speak, couldn't. Instead, I reached out and brushed my hand against his sleeve, sliding the folded napkin onto the tablecloth next to his vintage cognac. Sung-il didn't flinch. He was a man built of stone and secrets, but as his eyes dropped to the scrawled handwriting, I felt the temperature in the room plummet. Your fiancé sold you out. They're outside. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The clinking of silver ceased. The laughter died in the throats of the elite. Beside him, Sumin froze, her phone slipping an inch in her grasp as she felt the shift in the predatory air. Sung-il didn't look at her. He didn't look at the doors. He looked at me, his dark eyes searching mine for the lie he knew wasn't there. In that look, the quiet before the explosion evaporated. He didn't ask how I knew. He simply closed his hand over the note, crushing the paper into his palm. The man of stone stood up, and for the first time, the king looked at the child as if she were the only thing in the room that mattered. Then the first window shattered. The outside had arrived, and the elegant gala was stripped away to reveal the cage it had always been. Gunfire chewed through the silk hangings, and as the screaming began, Sung-il's hand heavy and warm on my shoulder, he pulled me down into the beautiful, violent chaos of his world. The ballroom was a sea of moving shadows and shimmering silk, a place where wealth was measured by the silence of the room. I stood in the corner, my back pressed against the cool velvet of the curtains, smoothing the skirt of my blue dress. To the guests, I was a decorative afterthought, as invisible as the dust motes dancing in the light of the crystal chandeliers. But being invisible meant I was the only one truly watching. I watched the way the light caught the diamond on Park Sumin's finger, a rock so heavy it should have dragged her hand down. Instead, her fingers moved with a frantic, rhythmic precision over the screen of her phone. She sat to the left of Baek Sung-il, her posture perfect, her face a mask of bored elegance. But her eyes never left the device beneath the table's edge. Every few seconds, the screen's pale glow reflected in her pupils. I saw the messages. They weren't the words of a woman in love. They were short, jagged bursts of data. Perimeter clear. 3 minutes. Blue entrance. I looked at Sung-il. He was leaning back, a glass of amber liquid held loosely in his tattooed hand. He looked like a man who owned the air he breathed, oblivious to the fact that the woman beside him was counting down the seconds until he stopped breathing it altogether. He had been kind to me once. A small gesture, a heavy coat draped over my shoulders on a night when the wind bit through my skin. And in this world, kindness was a debt that had to be paid in blood or truth. The server passed by, his face a hollow mask of service, but I saw the way his eyes darted toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. He wasn't looking for more champagne. He was looking for a signal. The air in the room suddenly felt too thick to inhale, heavy with the scent of lilies and the ozone of an approaching storm. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress and felt the scrap of paper I had prepared. It was small, a fragile shield against the tide of violence about to break over us. I looked at the clock on the far wall. The gold hands were ticking toward the final minute. Sumin tucked her phone away and reached for her wine, her hand steady, her betrayal complete. She thought she had accounted for everything, the guards, the exits, the timing. She just hadn't accounted for the girl in the blue dress who knew how to read the silence. I stepped out from the shadows, the note hidden in my palm, and began my walk toward the center of the web. The walk across the ballroom felt like wading through deep water. Every step was a gamble against the sudden, sharp awareness of the men in black suits who lined the walls. I kept my head down, my gaze fixed on the hem of my blue dress, playing the part of a lost child looking for a parent. No one stopped me. In their world, a child was a ghost, a soft detail that didn't belong to the ledger of threats. I reached the head table just as a burst of forced laughter erupted from a nearby group. The sound masked the frantic thudding of my heart. Park Soo-min was leaning toward a donor, her smile a masterpiece of deception, her phone now face down on the white linen. She was so close I could smell the sharp, metallic tang of her perfume, the scent of a blade hidden in silk. I didn't hesitate. I reached out, my small hand trembling just enough to be real, and touched Baek Sung-il's arm. He didn't jump. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator that had nothing to fear. He turned his head, his dark eyes meeting mine with a flicker of recognition, a brief softening of the hard lines around his mouth. He thought I wanted a sweet or a glass of water. I leaned in, as if to whisper a secret, and pressed the folded scrap of paper into his tattooed palm. His skin was warm, a startling contrast to the icy dread pooling in my stomach. I pulled back immediately, retreating into the shadow of a decorative pillar. I watched him. It happened in less than 3 seconds. Sung-il opened his hand under the table, his expression remaining a mask of polite indifference. He read the 7 words. Your fiancé sold you out. They're outside. The change wasn't loud. There was no gasp, no sudden movement. Instead, the man I knew, the one who had tied my shoelace, simply ceased to exist. His eyes, once a deep, observant brown, turned into something cold and lethal, like frozen iron. The relaxation in his shoulders vanished, replaced by a terrifying, coiled tension. He didn't look at Soo-min. He didn't look at the doors. He looked straight ahead, his gaze boring into the empty air as he processed the geometry of the trap. Beside him, Soo-min sensed the shift. She paused mid-sentence, her smile faltering, her eyes darting toward him with a sudden, sharp suspicion. The air in the ballroom seemed to thin, the oxygen sucked out by the sheer force of his hidden rage. Sung-il reached for his cognac, but he didn't drink. He gripped the glass until his knuckles went white, his thumb stroking the rim in a slow, rhythmic circle. It was a countdown. He looked at me one last time, not with kindness, but with the grim acknowledgement of a general recognizing his only ally. Then he let the glass shatter on the floor. The sound of the cognac glass hitting the floor was the only warning. It wasn't a mistake. It was a starter's pistol. Before the first shard had even settled into the carpet, the massive oak doors at the end of the hall didn't just open, they disintegrated. The explosion was a physical weight, a wall of heat and splinters that turned the soft music into a jagged scream. For a second, the world went white. Then the outside poured in. Men in tactical black, their faces obscured by masks, moved with a synchronized cruelty that mirrored the digital countdown I'd seen on Sumin's phone. Down! Sung Il's voice wasn't a shout. It was a command that bypassed my fear and moved my bones. He didn't waste a heartbeat on the woman who had betrayed him. As Sumin dove toward the cover of the fallen table, her elegant dress snagging on a tipped chair, Sung Il reached out and caught the collar of my blue dress. He pulled me against him, his suit jacket smelling of cedar and the sudden, sharp scent of gunpowder. Bullets began to chew through the ballroom. The crystal chandeliers above us groaned and wept glass, showering the elite in a rain of diamonds and blood. Sung Il drew a matte black pistol from a holster I hadn't seen, firing 3 rhythmic shots toward the doorway to suppress the advance. He wasn't looking to win a war here. He was looking for a hole in the net. "Stay small," he hissed, his hand a heavy, protective anchor on my shoulder. We moved in a low, frantic crouch, using the chaos of the stampeding guests as a human shield. He steered me toward the service entrance, a door hidden behind a heavy velvet drape. Another burst of gunfire turned the drywall beside my head into a cloud of chalky dust. I didn't scream. I couldn't breathe enough to find the sound. We burst through the swinging doors into the kitchen, a world of stainless steel and blinding fluorescent light. Here, the panic was different. Clattering pans, shouting chefs, and the hiss of industrial stoves. Sung Il didn't slow down. He vaulted over a prep station, dragging me with him as the service doors behind us kicked open. The attackers were already in the hall. "The freight lift," Sung Il muttered, more to himself than me. He fired 2 more rounds into a stack of silver cooling racks, sending them crashing down to block the aisle. The air was thick with the smell of searing meat and cordite. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but the grip on my shoulder never wavered. In the middle of the carnage, the Mafia boss was a calm, killing machine, and I was the only thing he was taking with him. The heavy iron door of the freight lift hissed shut, sealing out the echoes of gunfire and the frantic screams of the dying. For a moment, the only sound was the mechanical groan of cables and the ragged, wet rasp of my own breath. Sung Il stood over me, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the flickering overhead light. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a ghost draped in expensive wool, his hands stained with a darkness that wouldn't wash off. The lift lurched to a halt in the bowels of the parking garage. The air here was damp, smelling of oil and old concrete. He didn't wait for the doors to fully retract before he hauled me out, his stride long and desperate. We reached the armored sedan, a slab of matte black steel that looked more like a coffin than a car. He threw me into the back seat and slammed the door, the heavy thud sounding like a gavel. Seconds later, the engine roared to life, a low-frequency growl that vibrated through the floorboards and into my teeth. We tore out of the garage, the tires screaming against the slick pavement as we breached the rainy night. Sung Il drove with a terrifying, focused silence. His eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, watching for the headlights of the men who had been his guests moments ago. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass, blurring the neon lights of the city into long, bleeding streaks of red and blue. I sat huddled in the corner of the leather seat, my blue dress torn at the hem, my small hands tucked into my lap. I was a stain of innocence in a vehicle built for war. Through the partition, I saw him glance back. Not at the road, but at me. The realization hit him then. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened. He wasn't just fleeing with a survivor. He was fleeing with the only person who had seen the digital ghost of Sumin's treachery. I was the ledger. I was the evidence. In his world, that made me either his greatest asset or his most dangerous liability. "Why?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly friction that barely rose above the hum of the tires. He didn't turn around. "Why did you give it to me?" I looked at the back of his head, at the intricate tattoos that climbed his neck like vines. I thought of the shoelace. I thought of the way the others looked through me, while he was the only one who had ever looked at me. I didn't answer. I didn't have the words yet. I just watched the city fly by, a blur of cold glass and tall shadows, knowing that the outside was still out there, and the man driving the car was now the only thing standing between me and the dark. The neon pulse of the city began to fade as we hit the outskirts, replaced by the rhythmic, hypnotic sweep of the windshield wipers. Sung-il's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road, but his mind was clearly back in the ballroom, or perhaps even further, back to the day the shadow first entered his light. It had begun 18 months ago at a charity auction in Jeju, a place where the air tasted of salt and the elite wore their greed like perfume. Park Soo-min hadn't arrived with a weapon. She had arrived with a smile that felt like a sanctuary. She was the daughter of a shipping magnate, or so the papers said, a woman who moved through the jagged edges of his world with a softness that Sung-il had forgotten existed. He remembered the first time she touched his hand. It wasn't the grasp of a conspirator, but the gentle pressure of someone who saw the man beneath the tattoos. She had curated her life to fit the hollow spaces in his, learning the exact temperature he liked his tea, the names of his fallen lieutenants, and the way he preferred silence over the hollow chatter of his associates. She had become his shadow, constant and quiet, a presence so integrated into his daily rhythm that he had stopped looking for her reflection in the glass. But as the tires hissed over the wet asphalt, the memories began to sour. Every coincidence of the last year now took on a jagged, ugly shape. The shipment seized in Busan, the sudden, unexplained heart attack of his most loyal advisor, the way she always seemed to be standing near his phone, her elegant fingers hovering just inches from his secrets. She hadn't just moved into his house. She had mapped his vulnerabilities like a structural engineer preparing a demolition. She had sat at his table, shared his bread, and slept beside him, all while threading the needle that would eventually stitch his shroud. The betrayal wasn't a sudden snap. It was a slow, deliberate poisoning. I watched him in the rearview mirror, his face a landscape of cold fury. He wasn't mourning a lover. He was mourning the lapse in judgment that had allowed a wolf to wear the skin of his fiancée. He had built an empire on the blood of his enemies, only to realize he had handed the keys to the kingdom to a ghost. The car swerved slightly as he hit a patch of standing water, the splash sounding like a final, mocking applause. Soo-min hadn't just wanted his life. She wanted his legacy, and she had used the one thing he thought he could trust against him: his own desire for peace. The safe house was a skeletal concrete structure tucked away in the industrial ribs of the city. It smelled of damp stone and cold iron, a stark departure from the suffocating lilies of the gala. Sung-il didn't turn on the lights. Instead, the room was washed in the sickly orange glow of a single street lamp filtering through the high, barred windows. He sat at a metal table, his tuxedo jacket discarded on the floor like a shed skin. In front of him lay a ledger and a map of the city, but they were blank, useless tools against a betrayal that lived in the digital ether. He looked at me, his eyes shadowed and hollow. He was a man drowning in a sea of ghosts, looking for a hand to pull him back to the surface. I walked to the table. My blue dress was stained with grease and plaster, the lace torn, but my mind was a camera that refused to blink. I reached for a pen. My hand felt heavy, the weight of the secrets I carried pressing down on my knuckles. I began to draw. I didn't write names, I didn't know them, but I drew symbols. I drew the jagged V of the logo I'd seen on the server's cufflink. I sketched the specific, erratic pattern of the signal bars on Soo-min's phone and the 3-digit code that had flashed in the corner of her screen. 702. Sung-il leaned in, his breath hitching. 702, he whispered, the words sounding like a curse. The precinct. She didn't just hire mercenaries. She bought the port authorities. I moved the pen again, sketching the map of the ballroom as I had seen it from my corner. I marked the spots where the men in suits had stood. Not his men, but the ones who had stayed too still, their hands never leaving their sides. I pointed to the kitchen entrance and then to the south balcony. They weren't guarding the exits, he realized, his voice dropping to a lethal hum. They were funneling me toward the center, toward the glass. He watched my hand move, his expression shifting from desperation to a terrifying clarity. I showed him the timing of the messages, the way the texts had pulsed in rhythm with the server's movements. I was giving him the architecture of his own execution. In that cold, dim room, the power dynamic shifted. I was no longer just a child he had saved. I was the ledger of his survival. I was the only one who had seen the faces behind the masks, the only one who had decoded the silent language of the coup. Sung-il reached out, his hand hovering over mine, not to stop the pen, but to acknowledge the weight of what I was doing. "You saw it all," he said, and for the first time it wasn't a question. It was a realization that his most trusted soldier wasn't a man with a gun, but a girl who knew how to look at the world without flinching. The silence of the safe house was different from the silence of the gala. It wasn't polished or performative. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a tomb. Sung-il sat across from me, the orange street lamp light catching the sharp angle of his jaw. He watched me for a long time, his gaze lingering on the way I sat, perfectly still, my hands folded, waiting for a command that might never come. "Who is waiting for you, Joan?" he asked. The question was a low vibration in the empty room. I looked at the floor, at the scuffed toes of my patent leather shoes. The answer was a hollow space in my chest. There were no parents in the shadows, no frantic phone calls being made to the police, no one wondering why a blue dress hadn't returned home. I was a child of the fringes, raised by a series of aunts who were paid in crumpled bills to keep me fed and out of sight. I had been a witness to his world because I had no world of my own. "No one," I said. My voice sounded small and brittle, like dry leaves skittering over pavement. Sung-il didn't offer a platitude. He didn't reach out to pat my head or tell me it would be okay. He was a man who dealt in the currency of truth, and the truth was that I was astray in a city of wolves. He stood up, his movements fluid and sharp, and walked to a heavy duffel bag in the corner. He pulled out a small, sleek object. Not a toy, but a tactical radio, its matte surface cold and unforgiving. "In my world, Joan, there are no families. There are only debts and assets," he said, placing the radio on the metal table between us. "You saved my life, which means I owe you a debt. But in this city, a debt is just a target on your back unless you know how to defend it." He leaned in, his face inches from mine. The smell of cedar and gunpowder was fainter now, replaced by the cold scent of rain. Rule 1. Never look at the face. Look at the hands. The face is a lie, but the hands tell you what they're about to do. Rule over your fear or it will rule over you. Do you understand? I looked at the radio, then back at his lethal iron eyes. I realized then that he wasn't going to give me a doll or a bed with soft sheets. He was giving me something much more dangerous. A seat at his table. He was treating me like a soldier because he knew that in the days to come, a child wouldn't survive, but a ghost might. I reached out and placed my hand on the radio. "Look at the hands," I whispered. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, sharp, fleeting, and devoid of warmth. The adoption was silent and bloodbound. I wasn't his daughter, and he wasn't my father. I was his eyes, and he was my edge. The shipyard smelled of salt, rusted iron, and the electric tension of a gathering storm. It was the kind of place where things went to be forgotten, a graveyard of shipping containers and skeletal cranes. We sat in the dark interior of a rusted warehouse, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic drip-drop of a leaking pipe. Sung-il moved with a predatory stillness, his focus fixed on the encrypted tablet in his lap. We weren't hiding anymore, we were fishing. He had used my memory of the code 702 to bypass the Port Authority's firewall, sending a single, untraceable ping to Sumin's private server. It was a digital breadcrumb, a ghost of his location that led directly to this pier. "She won't send the police," Sung-il murmured, his voice a low rasp. "Not yet. She'll want to see me fall herself. She'll want to stand over the king to make sure he's actually dead before she claims the throne." He understood the vanity of the woman he had intended to marry. Sumin's greatest flaw wasn't her cruelty. It was her need to be witnessed. She didn't just want him gone. She wanted to see the moment the light left his eyes, to prove to herself that she had one. I stood by the window, my small frame hidden by a stack of moth-eaten tarps. I watched the perimeter through the thermal goggles Sung-il had taught me to use. The world was a wash of cold blues and greens until a flash of orange heat appeared near the gate. Then another. Then 3 more. Hands? I whispered, the word a soft breath against the glass. Sangayel was at my side instantly. He didn't need the goggles. He saw the black sedans rolling toward the warehouse with their lights extinguished. A funeral procession for a man who refused to die. At the center of the formation was a sleek, silver coupe, Sumin's favorite toy. She's here, he said, and the air around him seemed to crystallize into ice. He handed me the radio and pointed toward the ventilation shaft we had prepped earlier. It was a narrow, dark tunnel that led to the rafters, a vantage point where I would be invisible even to the most trained eye. Remember the rules, Joan. You are the shadow. You see the movement before it happens. You tell me when the blade is coming. I nodded, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, but my hands remained steady. I climbed into the darkness of the shaft, the cold metal biting into my skin, and watched through the slats as the warehouse doors groaned open. Sumin stepped into the light, her elegant heels clicking against the concrete, a silhouette of murderous vanity. She walked into the center of the trap, flanked by her hired shadows, looking for a broken man. She didn't realize that the man she was looking for was behind her, and the girl she had forgotten was above her, holding the thread that would unravel her world. The warehouse was a cathedral of shadows, lit only by the pale, sickly moon filtering through the high rafters. Below me, Sumin moved with the arrogance of a victor, her silver dress shimmering like fish scales in the dark. She stopped in the center of the kill zone, her guards fanning out in a wide arc. "Come out, Sangayel," she called, her voice echoing with a jagged, mocking sweetness. "Let's end this with the dignity you pretend to have." From my perch in the ventilation shaft, I didn't watch her face. I watched her hands. Her right hand was tucked into her clutch, the knuckles white. Her guards were restless, their fingers twitching near their holsters. I keyed the radio, my voice a ghost's whisper. 3 o'clock behind the crate. 5 o'clock under the crane. She has the detonator in her bag. The silence that followed was broken by the sudden, violent roar of an engine. Sangayel didn't come from the shadows. He came from the sky. He had rigged the overhead freight lift to drop, and as the heavy steel platform crashed down, it didn't hit Sumin. It isolated her. The scream of twisting metal and the explosion of concrete dust turned the warehouse into a blind man's nightmare. In the chaos, Sangayel was a blur of lethal precision. He moved through the dust like a reaper, the muzzle flashes of his pistol illuminating the red spray of the guards who never saw him coming. I stayed on the radio, my eyes never leaving the thermal heat of Sumin's silhouette as she scrambled toward the exit. "She's moving left," I whispered, targeting the fuel line. Sangayel intercepted her at the edge of the pier. The rain began to fall in earnest then, a heavy, cleansing deluge. By the time I climbed down from the rafters and stepped into the light, it was over. Sumin was on her knees, her silver dress ruined, her vanity stripped away to reveal the raw, trembling fear beneath. Sangayel stood over her, the barrel of his gun resting lightly against her forehead. He didn't look at her. He looked at me as I approached, my blue dress dark with soot and rain. "She was a mistake of the heart, Joan," he said, his voice as cold as the harbor water. "A king cannot afford those, but a king can always use a witness." He pulled the trigger without blinking. The sound was swallowed by a crack of thunder. Years later, people would whisper about the girl who sat at the right hand of the boss, the one who never spoke, but whose eyes saw the end of every conspiracy before it even began. As Sangayel turned away from the edge of the pier and held out his hand to me, I didn't see a monster. I saw the only world I had left. I reached out and took his hand, stepping over the ghost of the woman who had underestimated a child, and together, we walked into the birth of a new, silent dynasty. Here are some lessons to learn from the story. The story of Joan and Sangayel serves as a chilling meditation on the nature of survival and the hidden weight of the invisible. This primary moral lesson is that underestimating the observer is a fatal error. In a world of loud egos and grand betrayals, Power often resides with those who remain silent and watchful. Joan's neutrality was not a lack of agency, but her greatest weapon. She saw the truth because she was the only one not blinded by her own reflection. Furthermore, the narrative explores the cyclic nature of loyalty and debt. Sung Il's survival was bought not by his tactical brilliance or his empire's reach, but by a single, small act of humanity, tying a child's shoelace. This suggests that in the darkest environments, even the smallest spark of kindness can yield a life-saving return. Finally, the story offers a stark look at chosen family versus cold utility. Joan and Sung Il's bond is a new dynasty built on mutual necessity. It teaches that while trauma can forge an unbreakable alliance, the cost of safety in a violent world is often the permanent loss of innocence.